One simple refusal to bend the knee was all it took to shatter the ironclad order of the Pulido estate. Michael Pulido wasn't just a donor or a socialite. He was the undisputed shadow governor of the city, a man whose very whisper could collapse a multi-million-dollar shipping empire. His world ran on a single, unbreakable law: total submission. Men with blood on their hands trembled when he entered a room, and lieutenants who had survived gang wars stammered in his presence. But the one thing he couldn't command was the spirit of a woman in a pressed black and white uniform. While a room full of hardened criminals and corrupt politicians dropped to their knees in a sickening display of forced loyalty, Rachel Anderson did the unthinkable. She didn't bow. She didn't tremble. She stood as straight as a marble pillar amidst a sea of cowards and looked the most dangerous man in the country in the eye with a calm that bordered on an insult. What happened next didn't just cost her a job. It ignited a fuse that threatened to blow the city apart. The smell of cheap floor wax and industrial bleach had been the constant companion of Rachel's life for the last 5 years. It was 5 a.m. in the cramped, windowless staff locker room, where the air was always heavy and the light bulbs flickered with a rhythmic, dying beat. Rachel adjusted her bun, her fingers stiff from scrubbing floors. She checked her reflection in a cracked mirror. 3 more shifts until she had enough to pay the next installment for her brother's defense attorney. It was a relentless, soul-crushing grind, but with her brother's life hanging on a wrongful conviction and a legal system that moved like molasses, she was his only hope. The heavy oak doors to the main hall groaned open, and the temperature in the house seemed to drop 10 degrees. It wasn't just the arrival of the master of the house. It was the arrival of a predator. 2 bodyguards moved in first, their eyes cold and scanning for any sign of threat, followed by the heavy, deliberate footsteps of Michael Pulido. The locker room of the Sterling estate smelled of industrial-grade lavender and the faint, metallic scent of cold stone. Rachel Anderson stood before the warped mirror, her fingers moving with practiced precision as she pinned her hair into a bun so tight it felt like it was holding her entire life together. She wasn't just Rachel today. She was a shadow in a starch-white apron, a ghost meant to polish the silver and disappear into the wallpaper. She reached into her pocket and felt the crinkle of a letter. It was postmarked from Stateville Correctional Center. She didn't need to open it to know what it said. Marcus's voice lived in those pages, thin, desperate, and increasingly hollow. "They're moving me to General Pop, Ray. I won't last a month in there. Please." That please was a weight that lived in her chest, heavier than the buckets of lies she hauled or the vacuum she pushed across 10,000 square feet of Persian rugs. Justice in the city wasn't blind. It was expensive. Her brother had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a convenient scapegoat for a precinct that needed a quick win. Now, the only thing standing between Marcus and a life sentence was a private investigator who cost $500 an hour and a defense attorney who wouldn't even pick up the phone for less than a 5-figure retainer. Her day had started at 4 a.m. at the laundromat, pulling steaming sheets from industrial dryers until her skin felt parched. Now, as the sun began to bleed over the Chicago skyline, her second shift was beginning. She looked at her hands. They were rough, the nails cut short, a map of hard labor that no amount of lotion could hide. She was 24 years old, but in the reflection of the locker room, she saw a woman who had aged a decade in the 3 years since the handcuffs clicked shut on her brother's wrists. A sharp rap on the locker room door made her jump. It was Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, a woman whose face was etched with the permanent lines of someone who had seen too much and said too little. "He's in a mood," Gable whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation. "The meeting last night went late. No one goes into the dining room except to serve. And for heaven's sake, Rachel, keep your head down. He's looking for a reason to clear the floor today." Rachel nodded, smoothing her apron one last time. She knew the drill in the Pulido household. The staff was a collection of moving parts, easily replaced and even more easily discarded. Michael Pulido didn't just fire people. He erased them. He demanded a world of absolute order, where his word was gravity and everyone else was just trying not to fall. As she stepped out into the hallway, the transition was jarring. The dingy staff quarters gave way to marble floors so polished they looked like deep, dark water. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen explosions from the vaulted ceilings. It was a palace built on secrets and blood, and Rachel was the invisible girl tasked with keeping it clean. She felt the letter in her pocket again. She just needed to survive the shift. 3 more months of this, and she'd have the retainer. She just had to be a ghost. She just had to stay invisible. She just had to make sure she didn't give the lion a reason to roar. The air inside the grand dining hall was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and tension, so sharp it felt like a physical weight against Rachel's chest. She moved with the fluid, practiced silence of a woman who had spent years mastering the art of being invisible. In her hands, a heavy silver tray felt like a shield. This was her first official night assigned to the inner sanctum, the lion's den, where Michael Pulido didn't just eat, but where he decided who lived and who broke. The room was a masterpiece of intimidation. High, coffered ceilings trapped the low murmurs of men in tailored suits, and the light from the massive crystal chandelier shattered across the table like shards of ice. At the head of it all sat Michael. He didn't need to raise his voice to command the room. He simply existed at its center, a predator in repose. Rachel kept her eyes on the fine china, placing the appetizers with a steady hand, even as she felt the predatory gaze of the men around the table. Suddenly, the low hum of conversation died. The silence was instantaneous, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Michael had set his fork down with a deliberate, rhythmic clink. He didn't look up, but his voice drifted across the table, cold and smooth as polished marble. "Step forward, Antonio." A man standing near the mahogany sideboard, a guard who looked solid and immovable only moments before, suddenly seemed to shrink. His face went the color of ash. Rachel felt the air in the room turn brittle. She stood by the velvet curtains, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs that she refused to let show in her expression. "I gave you one task," Michael said, finally looking up. His eyes weren't angry. They were worse. They were indifferent. To ensure the shipment at Pier 49 was secured. "And yet, I find that a crate of my property has vanished, and you were seen sharing a drink with a man who works for the Valenti family." "Sir, it wasn't what it looked like." Antonio's voice cracked, a high, desperate sound that seemed to offend the very walls of the room. Michael stood up slowly, leaning forward over the table. The movement was predatory, his fists planting firmly on the polished wood. "In this house, Antonio, there's only one sin: disobedience. And I don't keep broken tools." The firing wasn't a human resources meeting. 2 of Michael's enforcers stepped from the shadows. They didn't grab Antonio. They simply stood behind him, a silent promise of what was coming. Michael didn't even look at the man as he was let out of the side door. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew that Antonio wouldn't be looking for a new job in the morning. He wouldn't be looking for anything ever again. Michael turned his gaze slowly toward the staff. The other maids and servers had lowered their heads, their eyes fixed firmly on the floor in a desperate attempt to show they had seen nothing. They were terrified, their bodies practically vibrating with the need to disappear. But Rachel didn't look down. She felt the heat of Michael's stare settle on her. It was a challenge, a demand for her to break, to show the same fear that fueled his empire. Instead, she tightened her grip on her composure. She met his intense, dark eyes with a gaze that was as level and unyielding as a horizon. She didn't bow. She didn't flinch. In that moment, amidst the opulence and the hidden blood, she realized that while he owned the house, he didn't own the woman standing in it. The lion had found something he couldn't frighten, and the hunt had officially begun. The silence following Antonio's removal was not empty. It was a pressurized vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. The guests, men who traded in secrets and violence, sat like wax figures, their forks suspended, their breathing shallow. They were waiting for the next strike of the hammer. Michael Pulido remained standing, his large, scarred hand still splayed across the mahogany table. The candlelight caught the sharp edge of his cheekbones and the lethal stillness in his eyes as he slowly pivoted his attention back to the line of servants. "Kneel," Michael said. It wasn't a shout. It was a soft, jagged command that vibrated through floorboards. To his guests, it was a display of absolute sovereignty, a reminder that in this house, Every soul was a tenant of his mercy. One by one, the staff collapsed. The veteran servers, who had seen decades of blood and silk, dropped as if their hamstrings had been cut. Mrs. Gable was the first, her knees hitting the hard marble with a dull thud that echoed against the vaulted ceiling. The younger maids followed, their heads bowed so low their chins pressed against their chests, their bodies trembling with the primal urge to become small, to become nothing. Rachel felt the shift in the air, the collective surrender of the room. She felt the weight of her brother's letter in her pocket, a reminder of why she was here, of the stakes that should have forced her to her joints. But as the person on her left sank down, Rachel felt a different kind of weight, the iron rod of her own dignity. She didn't move. Michael's eyes snapped to her. The intrigue that had been a flicker moments ago now roared into a flame. He rounded the table, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the stone. He stopped inches from her, his presence an overwhelming wall of expensive cologne and cold power. He was a foot taller than her, a mountain of a man who could end her career and her life, with a single nod to the shadows. He leaned forward, mirroring the aggressive stance he had taken with the doomed guard, his face so close to hers that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark irises. "I believe I gave an order, Rachel," he hissed, his voice a low vibration intended only for her. "Perhaps you didn't hear it over the sound of your own pride." "I heard you, Mr. Pulido," Rachel replied. Her voice was steady, lacking the frantic edge of the others. It was the voice of a woman who had already looked into the abyss of the Chicago legal system and refused to blink. "Then why are you still standing?" "Because my mother taught me that you only kneel for God," she said, her gaze locked onto his, unyielding and crystalline. "And I don't see him in this room." The intake of breath from the table was audible. Rico, the underboss, gripped his wine glass, so hard the stem looked ready to snap. Michael's jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing in his neck. For a long, harrowing minute, the world narrowed down to the space between them. The predator and the maid who refused to be prey. He didn't strike her. He didn't call the guards. Instead, a slow, dangerous smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile of kindness. It was the look of a collector who had just found something priceless and intended to break it in private. "Clean the table," Michael commanded, never breaking eye contact. "And when you're done, you aren't going back to the staff quarters. You're moving to the third floor. My floor." The third floor of the Pulido estate was a realm of hushed footsteps and shadows, a place where the air felt pressurized by the weight of secrets. Moving her belongings took less than 10 minutes. Everything Rachel owned fit into a single duffel bag, a sparse collection of worn books, and the legal transcripts that were the blueprint of her brother's salvation. Her new quarters were located just down the hall from Michael's private study, a grand, mahogany-clad sanctuary that smelled of old leather and tobacco. Michael's intention was clear. This wasn't promotion, it was a siege. He wanted her close, under the constant heat of his scrutiny, hoping that the proximity to his power would eventually force her to buckle. For the first 2 days, he ignored her presence, treating her like a piece of furniture as he conducted grim business with men who looked like they had been forged in a furnace. But Rachel was not a woman who could simply stand still. On the third morning, she entered his study while he was away at the docks. The room was a chaotic battlefield of discarded files, half-empty whiskey glasses, and crumpled ledgers. To any other maid, it was a mess to be dusted. To Rachel, it was a puzzle. As she moved through the room, her eyes instinctively snagged on a series of invoices left on the desk. Years of meticulously tracking every cent from Marcus's legal fund had given her a hawk's eye for discrepancies. She noticed a repeating line item for security maintenance paid to a shell company she didn't recognize, payments that were bloated, inconsistent with the other records. While she polished the heavy brass lamps, she began to sort the chaos. She didn't just clean, she organized. The haphazard stacks of files were categorized by date and urgency. The whiskey glasses were replaced with a carafe of ice water. By the time the heavy oak door swung open, the room was transformed. Michael stepped in, his coat dusted with the soot of the city, his face a mass of exhaustion and irritation. He stopped short, his gaze sweeping over the pristine desk. He looked at the sorted files, then at Rachel, who was quietly buffing the edge of a bookshelf. "I didn't tell you to touch my papers," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "You told me to clean your floor, Mr. Pulido," Rachel replied, her voice calm and level. "It's hard to see the floor when it's buried under 6 months of bad bookkeeping." He walked to the desk, his eyes narrowing as he saw a small, handwritten note she had left on top of a specific ledger. It pointed directly to a 3% leak in his shipping logistics, money that was being diverted, likely by Rico's men. The silence that followed was different than the one in the dining room. It wasn't born of fear, but of a sudden, sharp realization. Michael looked at the note, then back at the woman in the simple maid's uniform. He had brought her here to break her spirit, to show her the magnitude of the world he controlled. Instead, she had looked at his empire and found the cracks he hadn't even noticed. "You're overstepping, Rachel," he murmured, though the edge of his anger had been replaced by a deep, calculating curiosity. "I'm doing my job," she said, meeting his gaze without a hint of apology. "If you want someone to just nod and look at the floor, you should have hired back the girl who knelt." For the first time, Michael didn't look at her as a servant or a trophy of defiance. He looked at her as a threat, and perhaps the only person in the house who wasn't lying to him. The stillness of the third floor was shattered at 3 a.m. by a sound Rachel hadn't expected to hear in this house. The sharp, jagged ring of glass breaking against stone. She had been awake, hunched over Marcus's latest legal brief by the dim light of a bedside lamp. But the sound drew her into the hallway. The door to Michael's private study was slightly ajar, casting a long, amber rectangular glow across the carpet. She pushed the door open softly. The room was heavy with the scent of spilled bourbon and the dying embers in the fireplace. Michael was slumped in the velvet chair behind his desk, but the predator was gone. His tie was undone, hanging like a noose around his neck, and his head was buried in his hands. On the floor lay a shattered crystal tumbler and a crumpled piece of parchment. A betrayal that looked like a simple letter. Rachel didn't retreat. She moved into the room, her footsteps silent. She picked up the larger shards of glass, her movements methodical. As she reached for the letter, Michael's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. His touch was hot, but his fingers were trembling. It was the first time she had felt him shake. "It was Rico," he rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. He didn't look at her, but his grip didn't loosen. "My father's godson, the man I pulled out of the gutters of Little Italy. He's been selling the routes to the Valenti family for months." Rachel looked down at him. From this angle, the king of Chicago looked remarkably small. The shadows under his eyes weren't just from a lack of sleep. They were the bruises of a man who realized he was standing on a throne built of shifting sand. He wasn't just a boss. He was a prisoner of his own reputation, unable to trust the men he broke bread with, forced to be a monster so he wouldn't become a victim. "You're surprised," Michael said, finally letting go of her wrist and looking up. His eyes were bloodshot, searching hers for the usual fear or judgment. He found neither. "I'm not surprised by the betrayal, Mr. Pulido," Rachel said quietly, smoothing the crumpled letter on the desk. "I'm surprised you thought loyalty could be bought with a paycheck and a threat. You surrounded yourself with men who only follow you because they're afraid to lead. That isn't a kingdom. It's a cage." Michael let out a short, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "And what would a maid know about kingdoms?" "I know that I can walk out of that front door whenever I choose," she replied, meeting his gaze with a piercing clarity. "I might be poor and my brother might be in a cell, but my soul is mine. You can't even pour a drink without wondering if there's cyanide in the bottle. Between the two of us, Michael, I'm the one who's free." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire, the power dynamic that had defined their relationship. The hunter and the prey dissolved in the amber light. Michael didn't snap at her. He didn't order her to kneel. He simply looked at her, truly seeing the strength she carried. And for the first time, he looked like a man who wished he could remember how it felt to stand as tall as she did. The transition from the sanctuary of the estate to the concrete canyons of the city was always jarring, but today, the air felt especially heavy. Michael had insisted Rachel accompany him to a legal consultation, a thinly veiled attempt to show his associates that she was now under his personal protection. They sat in the back of a reinforced black sedan, the silence between them no longer a battleground, but a strange shared truce. Michael was staring out the window, his hand resting near his jacket pocket, while Rachel clutched her bag. The weight of her brother's case files a constant reminder of her true purpose. The world exploded in a spray of silver and fire. A heavy-duty truck slammed into the lead escort vehicle, and a split second later, the side window of the sedan spiderwebbed as a high-velocity round punched through the reinforced glass. The car swerved violently, tires shrieking against asphalt before slamming into a concrete pillar. For a moment, there was only the hiss of steam and the ringing in Rachel's ears. Then came the shouting and the rhythmic pop-pop-pop of gunfire. "Michael?" Rachel gasped, coughing through the settling dust of the airbags. He didn't answer. He was slumped against the door, his face ashen. A jagged shard glass or shrapnel had bypassed his vest, slicing deep into the brachial artery of his upper arm. Bright, arterial blood was already soaking through his bespoke suit jacket, pooling on the Italian leather seat with terrifying speed. "Rico." Michael wheezed, his eyes unfocused. He didn't wait. "Don't talk," Rachel commanded. The terror that should have paralyzed her was pushed aside by a cold, clinical instinct. Before she was a maid, before she was a waitress, she spent 2 years in nursing school, a dream deferred by her brother's legal fees. Outside, his security detail was engaged in a desperate firefight, but inside the car, the clock was ticking down to 0. Rachel grabbed her spare apron from her bag, the heavy, cotton fabric she kept as a backup. She didn't hesitate. She ripped the fabric into a long, sturdy strip. "I need you to hold this," she told him, her voice a calm anchor in the chaos. She shoved a wad of the remaining fabric against the wound, applying the full weight of her body. Michael groaned, his head lolling back. "Stay with me, Michael. Look at me." He forced his eyes open, locking onto hers. She saw the shock there, not just from the wound, but from the sight of her, the woman who had refused to kneel, now hovering over him with blood-stained hands, fighting to keep his soul in his body. With a grunt of effort, she looped the makeshift tourniquet high above the wound, using a heavy fountain pen from the floorboard to twist it tight. She watched the terrifying flow of blood slow to a sluggish drip. Her hands were stained crimson, her uniform ruined, but the light in his eyes stayed steady. The car door was ripped open from the outside. It was his lead guard, Marco, face grimy with smoke. "We have to move, boss. The backup is here." Marco stared at Rachel, then at the expertly tied tourniquet. He didn't ask questions. He helped Michael out of the wreckage. As they bundled him into a secondary vehicle, Michael gripped Rachel's hand. He didn't have the strength to speak, but the way his fingers curled around hers said everything. She wasn't just a help anymore. She was the only reason he was still breathing. The Pulido estate had become a fortress of whispers following the ambush. Michael was confined to his private wing, his arm bound in a heavy sling, while the tension in the house reached a fever pitch. Rachel moved through the corridors like a specter, her presence so normalized by her uniform that the men plotting in the shadows forgot she had ears. She was polishing the brass fixtures of the heavy double doors leading into the library when the muffled sound of voices stopped her hand. The hit in the sedan was supposed to be the end of it. A voice rasped. It was Rico. The jagged edge of his tone was unmistakable. "Now the old man is paranoid, and the Valenti family is breathing down my neck for the shipping codes. If we don't move tonight, we're all dead men." Rachel's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She pressed her ear closer to the cold wood. "Michael's security detail is thin in the east wing," another voice added. One of the younger captains Rachel had served coffee to just that morning. "We take out the guards at midnight, seal the 3rd floor, and blame the Valentis for the cleanup. By dawn, you're the head of the table, Rico." Rachel pulled back, her breath coming in shallow hitches. She looked down the long, opulent hallway. The front exit was less than 50 yards away. She had her brother's legal files in her locker and enough cash hidden in her mattress to get a bus ticket out of the city. This was her chance. She could run, disappear into the gray Chicago fog, and let these monsters tear each other apart. If Michael fell, her contract was void. She owed him nothing. He was a man built on violence and greed, a man who had tried to break her spirit from the moment they met. But then she remembered the weight of his hand on hers in the back of the blood-stained sedan. She remembered the look of absolute, terrifying isolation in his eyes when he realized his family had turned into vipers. If she left, he wouldn't just lose his empire. He would be executed in his own bed by the men he had trusted. The letter from Marcus crinkled in her pocket. She thought her brother, an innocent man caught in a corrupt system. And then she thought of Michael, a guilty man who was the only person with the power to fix it. If Michael died tonight, Marcus's last hope died with him. Her choice wasn't born of loyalty to the mob or a sudden love for a criminal. It was born of the same unyielding dignity that had kept her standing when he ordered her to kneel. She wouldn't let vipers win by default. Rachel didn't head for the exit. Instead, she turned toward the grand staircase, her footsteps silent on the marble. She bypassed the main security hub, knowing now that the guards were likely compromised. She took the narrow servant stairs, rising toward the third floor, toward the lion's den, to warn the devil she knew about the demons at the gate. The warning had barely left Rachel's lips when the first explosion rocked the east wing, a dull thud that sent a tremor through the floorboards of Michael's study. The power surge once flickered and then died, plunging the third floor into a terrifying velvet darkness. In the sudden silence, the sound of glass shattering and the rhythmic staccato of suppressed gunfire drifted up from the gardens. The coup had begun. "Rachel, get in the vault," Michael commanded, his voice a low, urgent rasp. He was already on his feet, reaching into mahogany desk for a heavy black handgun, despite the sling tethering his left arm. "There isn't time," she whispered, grabbing his good arm as another blast shook the house. "They aren't just coming for you. They're sealing the floor. If you stay here, you're in a coffin." She led him out of the study and into the back service hallway, a narrow, secondary artery of the house that the architects had built for staff and that Rico had likely overlooked in his arrogance. They moved through the darkness, Michael's heavy, labored breathing the only sound against the backdrop of the chaos below. The opulence of the mansion had transformed into a labyrinth of lethal shadows. Every corner held the threat of a silhouette, every creak of the floorboards a potential executioner. They reached the grand gallery, where the moonlight spilled to the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long skeletal shadows across the marble. Suddenly, a beam of light cut through the dark. "There!" a voice shouted. Bullets chewed into the plaster behind them. Michael pivoted, firing 3 steady shots that sent the attackers diving for cover, but the recoil sent a fresh wave of agony through his wounded shoulder. He stumbled, his face going the color of ash. Rachel caught him, her small frame bracing his weight. "The laundry chute," she hissed, pulling him toward a nondescript wooden door hidden behind a tapestry. "It leads directly to the basement level. They won't expect you to go down toward the fire. It's a 30-foot drop, Rachel," he wheezed, sweat beading on his forehead. "Then we go together," she said, her eyes locked onto his with the same unyielding steel he had seen in the dining room. As the heavy footsteps of Rico's men pounded closer, they squeezed into the narrow, metal-lined passage. It was a desperate, lightless descent, the friction burning their skin as they plummeted to the heart of the house. They hit the piles of linen at the bottom, just as the door above was kicked open. Buried in the scent of bleach and laundry soap, they lay still, paralyzed by the sound of muffled shouts coming from the floor they had just escaped. Michael turned his head toward her in the dark, his hand finding hers. His grip was no longer a command or threat. It was a lifeline in the belly of his own fortress, surrounded by the men who wanted him dead. The only thing keeping the King of Chicago alive was the woman he had tried to break, and the quiet dignity of the shadow he had finally begun to see. The basement air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, damp smell of concrete. Michael leaned against a massive boiler, his face the color of bone, his breath hitching as he checked his final magazine. Above them, the mansion was a chorus of chaos. Boots thundering on marble and the distant, muffled shouts of Rico's men as they realized the lion had slipped through their fingers. Michael looked at Rachel. The pristine maid's uniform she had worn with such poise was torn and stained with his blood, but her eyes remained as clear and unyielding as the day they met. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, brass-keyed ring and a folded stack of high-denomination bills he had kept in the basement safe. He pressed them into her hand. "The service tunnel behind the furnaces leads to the old carriage house," Michael rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "There's a car there. The keys are on that ring. Take the money, Rachel. Go to the airport, hire that lawyer, and get your brother out. Our contract is over. You don't owe me your life." Rachel looked at the keys, then at the man who had spent his life demanding every soul around him bend to his will. For the first time, he wasn't ordering her. He was offering her the one thing she worked every waking hour for, a way out. "If I leave," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the tremor in the floor above, "you'll never make it out of this basement. You can't even steady your aim with that arm." "It doesn't matter," Michael said, a grim, weary smile touching his lips. "I've spent my life surrounded by people I bought or bullied. Just once, I'd like to know I did something that wasn't for a price. Go, Rachel. Be free." Rachel looked at the tunnel, the dark path to the life she had dreamed of. Then she looked at the heavy iron fire, poker resting against the boiler. She didn't take the keys. Instead, she dropped them onto the concrete floor with a sharp, metallic ring that echoed through the chamber. She picked up the iron rod, her grip tightening until her knuckles turned white. "I told you once that I only kneel for God," she said, stepping into the light of the single flickering bulb. "And I don't take charity from men who think they can decide when I'm finished. You didn't buy my loyalty, Michael, so you don't get to dismiss it. We finished this together." Before he could protest, the heavy steel door at the top of the stairs groaned. Rico stepped into the frame, a silhouette of betrayal silhouetted by the emergency lights. He began to descend, his weapon raised, a smirk of triumph playing on his lips. But he hadn't accounted for the invisible girl. As Rico leveled his gun at Michael, Rachel moved with ferocity born of years of suppressed rage. She didn't wait for a command. She swung the iron rod with a scream of defiance, catching Rico's wrist and sending the gun skittering across the floor. Michael seized the opening, firing a single, decisive shot that ended the coup in the life of the man who betrayed him. The silence that followed was absolute. Michael looked at Rachel, the woman who had stayed when she had every reason to run. He realized then that she wasn't his servant, his maid, or his lucky charm. She was his equal. He stood up, leaning on her for support, and together they walked toward the light of the morning, no longer master and maid, but two survivors who had finally found something worth standing for.